Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the next installment of the NTC podcast. Aaron Washington here. Glad to be back with you guys in another episode. We've had a lot to discuss over the past few weeks. As you may know, the NBA trade deadline just wrapped up, and the Luka Doncic trade really threw everybody for a loop, me included. And that was our last subject for our last podcast. We covered that on episode 130. This time around, 131, we're going to be covering another big deal that went down just before the deadline came about. That's going to be the Brandon Ingram trade that the Raptors and the Pelicans had just a few weeks ago. So we're going to get into that on this episode. But before we do, I have to introduce my special guest from The Athletic, from the Bleacher Report, Raptors Republic, wherever you may find his work. He does a lot. He's involved in a lot of different things. But this is going to be Esfandiar Baraheni as my guest this afternoon.
What's going on?
And love your work, man. I love what you do with Dave Dufour over there on the Athletic Daily Show and everything else you're involved in. So, man, it's just a pleasure to have you on this pod. Thanks for taking the time. And I'm really excited to talk Raptors this afternoon.
Yeah, man. Thank you for having me. Excited. Obviously, know there's a Dave Dufour connection. Always good to talk to a Dave Dufour pal. But I appreciate you, man. Thank you very much. Excited to talk Raptors. Although I don't know how excited people end up being to talk to Toronto Raptors this season.
Right. It's definitely a weird season for them, I think is a proper way to put it.
Yeah.
And before we get to the trade, I really just kind of want to take a look at the Raptors, take some stock of where they are. Where they were right before the trade. As you know, this is a rebuilding season for them by all accounts. They are near the bottom of the Eastern Conference, 13th, 17-38 is their record to this point. Just headed out of the All-Star break. The ratings reflect the same thing: 25th offense, 25th defense, 26th net rating according to Basketball Reference. So not exactly a team that's setting the world on fire, but they do have some great pieces that they have acquired through the past few transactions. Emmanuel Quickley, RJ Barrett, Pirtle, Scotty Barnes, and now Brandon Ingram. It's a pretty good core of players, I would say. So just kind of want to start off by just kind of highlighting a few players here and how they've done this season. I want to start with RJ Barrett, who came over in that Knicks trade last season. This is a player who he was heavily scrutinized in New York. Really just kind of called out on his weaknesses and things he didn't bring to the court. But he's evolved into a very good player. He's leading the team in scoring, 21.7 points per game, at least before Brandon Ingram came on board. Career high in rebounds, assists per game. He leads the league in usage rate. So, I mean, he's kind of been the driver for the team this season by most accounts. And a career high in assist percentage at 25%. So he's doing a lot for this team. But S, what have you noticed from RJ this season, kind of being the leader here and just kind of helping bring this team into a new era?
It's funny you mentioned leader because it's kind of interesting to look back on the season and really think that he has been the most consistent part of this Raptors team all year, both in the scoring department and in the using his physicality to attract defenses and just like the driving gravity that he has, attacking the rim and using that to make plays for others. You mentioned the assist percentage. I think that's the thing that he's shown immense growth, which is the playmaking. He's been better as a pick and roll ball handler. I would say for the first 2 or 3 months of the season, he was like a top 10 pick and roll ball handler and was one of the most efficient pick and roll players in the league. I think that's dropped a little bit recently, but for the first couple months, he was that good as a playmaker and as a passer, and especially as a guy who could get downhill and finish in traffic. So the two areas where I think RJ has really taken a step over his first year with the Raptors really is the playmaking department and just finishing in and around the basket more frequently. In New York, he would get to the basket, but he wouldn't finish at the basket well. And now he's finally finishing as well. Now he's actually completing that second part of the equation. And so there's this growth, both, I guess, as a leader off the floor, as a guy who's kind of rallying the troops, but also on the floor where he's just kind of refining his game. It's hard to like the fact that he's still 23, 24 years old is kind of surprising to people because he's been in New York for so long that it kind of is jarring when you hear the fact that he's still so young and still trying to figure things out. The man has not even hit his prime yet. There's still areas of his game that he needs to improve. Defensively is one of them. And I know he's talked about it for the last couple of months of stepping up on that end and being a part of the solution for the Raptors defensively. But overall, I think, based on the conversation that was around him in New York. A toxic asset was used when he got traded, and there was this idea that like he was on a terrible contract. Well, I think that's sort of changed over the last year. I think he's turned himself into a really useful player, and a player that the Raptors probably envision long term, but they want to see how this core moves together collectively before they kind of commit to any sort of extension, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree with your points there about RJ. He's turned into a very productive player, still flawed, as you said. He
Yeah.
still has some things to work on, but overall, I think he's kind of really harnessed his tools into just something more productive on the court, not just kind of being a loose cannon, so to speak, a guy that can get downhill and not finish, like you said, but improving steadily as like a shooter and an attacker, a finisher, things like that, getting guys involved. I think it's super valuable from a guy like him that's like a wing slash guard. I think he kind of bounces a little bit between 2 and 3.
Yeah.
But if you can get that from that position, that's super valuable, for a guy that can just be a connector and a driver of what they do on the basketball court.
Yeah, he connects a lot of pieces together for them. Once he actually makes life a lot easier for Scotty Barnes as well, connecting actions offensively. So, Scotty has stepped into this role in year one of the rebuild as like the guy. This is the first year for him as sort of the number one option on the team. RJ has actually made Scotty's life much easier because he provides a second offensive source. And there's also this element of like creation that RJ has, second side. Let's say that Scotty doesn't create anything, and then you kind of swing it to RJ on the other side, run an empty side pick and roll with him and Jakob Poeltl, and it creates a bunch for them. So he's been a good source of secondary offense. You mentioned the leading part. I would probably say Scotty is still the number one guy for this team. But in terms of effectiveness, it definitely has been RJ offensively.
For sure. And to transition to Scotty here real quick, he's had a
Mhm.
good season, and looking at his numbers, like nothing really jumps off the page. I wouldn't say that he's made like a massive stride in any one area. The shooting is a little bit of a concern, down to
Yeah.
26% for the season. His true shooting percentage is about 4 percentage points down from last season.
Mhm.
So, for him, he hasn't quite been as efficient as a scorer. But I did notice a similar jump in assist percentage to RJ Barrett.
Yeah.
So I would say that's another area. It is an area to where he's made some progress, just in terms of like again, just being a guy that can keep the ball moving, not playing a black hole, getting guys involved, being fairly effective off pick and rolls, things like that. And then his career high in points per game has also come this season. So for Scotty, what have you seen from him? Has he had like a pretty solid season in your opinion, or has he stagnated a bit? Because I've seen
Yeah.
some different opinions about him, but what do you think about his growth?
Yeah, he's definitely a polarizing player. And I think the reason for that is because he's kind of being asked to do more than what he probably would on the best version of this team, especially on the offensive end as a scorer. And so they're kind of putting him in adverse situations just to see the limits of what he can do, really. Part of that is like, hey, you're number one on the scouting report tonight. You're going to be number one on the scouting report for 82 games. Like, defenses are going to cover you a little bit differently there. You're going to see double teams. You're going to, if you catch the ball in the post in a mismatch, they're automatically sending a double. And so that's why you see that assist percentage go up. It's because he's making the right plays most of the time, but his scoring and his efficiency is dipped because of the added attention. I think part of that is also him figuring out what he needs to do as far as like a go-to bag for his scoring. He's really developed a mid-range craft. He's shooting a career high in the mid-range area this season. And I think that's part of him trying to figure out what his go-to is offensively. But if you ask Raptors fans, I think it's finding a balance between doing that, getting to those mid-range shots, and also finding a way to be as physical as possible. He's such a strong player, and he does a great job of imposing his physicality, that it kind of gets lost on his game a little bit when he's focusing so much on those short mid-range shots. And so finding that balance is something that's really important for Scotty moving forward. I've asked Darko Rajakovic about this before. It's like, how does Scotty end up striking that balance offensively to become a more efficient version of himself? What he basically described to me is that they're not worried about makes and misses right now, but more so about the process and finding ways for him to succeed while also experimenting. In December, there was a stretch there where Scotty was taking like 10 threes a game. That's obviously changed now. He doesn't take the 10 threes a game anymore, but it's all about trying to figure out what kind of offensive player he wants to be. And I think one thing they noticed, and probably part of the equation in acquiring a guy like Brandon Ingram, is that he needs a secondary guy to be able to create his own shot in a pinch and to work off of. Some of Scotty's best and most efficient scoring nights were next to Pascal Siakam, and it was because Siakam could draw so much attention on the offensive end that it made life easier for Scotty as a guy off of the ball, as a screener, as a rim runner, as a guy who can finish in and around the basket, using his physicality on mismatches. And so I think adding a guy like Ingram will actually make Scotty's scoring and his efficiency, all of that output, increase as well. So it's a combination of things. I think it's been a pretty inconsistent season for Scotty. He's shown flashes, in even stretches where he looks like an all NBA, all-star, and all defensive level player. But there's also flashes where he's really going through the motions of figuring out what kind of player he wants to be. And I think that's natural because this is truly his first year as the number one guy on a team. It was kind of not an organic rebuild for this Raptors team because they didn't start their rebuild when Scotty was in his rookie year. They tried to be competitive and go through the playoffs and build around Pascal and Fred VanVleet and all those guys. And then in his fourth year, they eventually started to reset. So I think it's a change of responsibilities and that output that kind of changes the situation for Scotty, and he's dealing with that right now.
Absolutely. No, you bring up a great point about like the changing circumstances that Barnes has encountered. Like things have been different every season of his career so far, like going from a playoff team to a bottom feeder to, everywhere in between. So no, I definitely agree with that. And I want to get back to his relationship with Brandon when we get to that part of the pod here. But real quick, before we get there, I wanted to highlight another player that's been impressive for the Raptors this season. It's a player that, when the deal was made, people had their questions like, is this really the path you want to go down to, the same questions that people have about the Ingram trade. But Jakob Poeltl has been a really pleasant surprise, or maybe not surprised, but he's just been like super solid and consistent for Raptors like all season. Averaging a double-double, 14 and 10. He's 24th in the league in total double-doubles. He has 19 and 45 games played, career high in points per game, rebounds per game. Even his free throw percentage is a career high, 65%, which is interesting. He's been such a subpar free throw shooter, but, he's gotten to a point where it's like, okay, we can at least live with, the percentage you're shooting on the floor right now. Yeah. And, he's providing some positive value for the 4-year, $80 million contract that he signed in June 23. And he has a player option in a couple seasons. But right now, he's just been a rock solid for this team. You know what you're going to get from him every night. He brings the hustle. He brings the energy. He's been a little bit banged up on the past few games, but overall, like he's a guy that you can throw out there and you're going to get some level of rim protection from him, crashing the boards, being a good roll man. So really great things from Poeltl this season, and I think he kind of helps everybody kind of find their place because Poeltl's going to be there in the middle, kind of keeping things grounded, keeping things solid, really on both ends of the floor.
He's the glue, man. He is the glue to everything they want to do on both ends of the floor. I think part of the reason the Raptors run such an egalitarian offense is because Jakob Poeltl is such a great playmaker at his position too. And so high post area, he's making plays. He's great at finding his teammates in that area too. He's tall, so he can oversee most of the defense and find teammates. And then on the defensive end, as you mentioned, pretty good rim protector, guy who can rebound the ball, really, really solid on that end. And they just collapse on defense when he's not on the floor. Like they just fall apart completely. And it's because there really isn't anybody else on the team that can replicate what he does. They have their rookie in Jonathan Mobo that they are excited about, but he's also 6'6", 6'7" on a good day, not necessarily a 7-footer. Ulrich Shamshe, which was their second-round pick from last year, is now out for the rest of the season. So they're missing a big man. They just traded Kelly Olynyk as well. And so when he's not on the floor or when he's hurt, their defense is just cataclysmically bad. Like it falls apart completely. And I would imagine that is going to be the case more towards the end of the season because lottery balls, kind of focusing on development, if you will. I think that'll be the situation moving forward with him too. One thing that's interesting about Jakob is that he's extension eligible this summer. And so I wonder if they do ink him to an extension, how that will look, what kind of price they're looking at or value they're looking at for a guy like Jakob. It seems like he's someone who wants to stay there long term. And if not, if they can't come to a contract extension, what does that mean for his future on the team? Will he eventually be on the chopping block again and all that type of stuff? So just an interesting couple of months here for Jakob moving forward, because there's obviously tons of questions about him being one of the older guys on the team. That being said, by acquiring Ingram, maybe they've tried to accelerate that process a little bit. And so they want to be competitive next season, maybe incentivizes Jakob to stick around longer, but a really fun player. And I think probably one of the most important players on the team right now with its current construction.
For sure. And one last player that kind of composes this core pre-Ingram is Emmanuel Quickley.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't gotten a lot of him this season. He's only played 16 games out of the 55 the Raptors have had. It's been disappointing from that aspect because we know what he can do when healthy. He's a guy that can definitely space the floor for a team that's going to need that spacing. Ingram is not a high volume 3-point shooter. Scotty is not. So a guy that can come in and really just start bombing from deep and just be a shifty guard for everybody and get everybody in the right spots is super valuable. So, it's been, again, kind of like the same theme as Barnes, a little inconsistent, a little bit up and down. There's been some games he's popped, especially in the assist department with his distribution. He can have games where he's double-digit assists for sure. But then other times you can see he's still kind of struggling. He's had some issues just staying on the court with whatever the issue is. I think he's had like 2 or 3 different injuries, I feel like, this season to this point. So, it looks like that might be playing a part in why it's been so up and down for him. But I'm still really high on his future with this team and what he brings to the table, because it's a nice kind of counterbalance to what the front court provides for the team. So, what are your general thoughts on Quickley? And, are you still high on him as a guy that the Raptors are building around the backcourt?
Yeah, I was really high on Quick when they acquired him for OG Anunoby in the RJ Barrett trade. And I kind of made this bold kind of claim that I think he could eventually become an all-star. I might have to walk back that claim just and it's kind of unfair to him because we haven't seen him a lot this season. You mentioned the injuries, and it's really hard to get your footing right. But I think there are moments where he is incredible for this team as a shooter, as a guy who can space the floor and be this off-ball player. But a lot of the stuff that he can provide to this team right now is what he provided to the Knicks already. Maybe at a higher level, maybe at a more output level in terms of shooting and whatnot and ball handling. But generally, it would, especially with Brandon Ingram being in this trade now and being on this team, his role has shifted from maybe being the second or third option to now he's looking at being like the third or fourth option on this team moving forward. And so I'm kind of curious to see how that looks. And actually, I think that'll benefit him a lot. I think playing with a guy like Ingram, who can also handle the ball, playing with a guy like Scotty Barnes, who can handle the ball, RJ Barrett can do a little bit of ball handling. I think that'll help Quickley unlock himself as an off-ball player and to really focus in on the defensive end of the ball, because I think coming in New York, he had this reputation as being a pretty decent defender. We haven't necessarily seen that in Toronto as much. And again, part of that is injuries. Part of that is not being available and not being at your fullest strength. So it's been unfortunate. So we can't really evaluate how Quickley has looked over the last little bit. But it's not the start you wanted to his initial contract. And I know a lot of people were skeptical about him signing that contract in the first place this summer. I think it's sort of wait and see right now with Quick, because you kind of just want to see how he looks with this new look core. And we'll see what happens moving forward with him and Ingram and Scotty all included. I think he makes much more sense as an off-ball player now next to that group. But is that what he wants? Because he sort of came into Toronto thinking, okay, I'm going to be one of the guys on this team, one of the main guys. And now it seems like he's more getting back to the role that he was in New York. So I'm kind of curious to see what happens. We'll be very, very interested to see how the next couple of years for Quickley will look in Toronto, for sure.
Absolutely, man. Like you said, like the Ingram acquisition is going to change a lot for him, really the whole team. Yeah. So I feel like it's a good time to kind of get into that part of the conversation, because that's really what has transformed this team, and it's leading them into a new era here. It's almost like a transition from like where they are right now, bottom feeders. you're down there in the lottery to something more, definitely for next season once everybody is whole. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to share my screen. I have the Toronto Raptors cap sheet here pulled up so we can kind of take a look at their current situation. So I have that right here. I'll pull that up, add it to stage. There we go. So we currently have the Raptors cap sheet up here if you guys are watching this podcast. And Brandon comes in as a guy that is definitely the leading earner on this team, $38 million. And he signed that 3-year extension for $120 million. So he's under contract. That 27-28 is a player option for almost 42. So Brandon's obviously a guy that's going to come in and, he's earned that money. He's been a guy for New Orleans that averaged 20 points per game 6 times. His 23 points per game in New Orleans, that's the 3rd in franchise history. So a guy that warrants a lot of money for sure. He is an A1 scorer, no doubt. So Toronto sent out Kelly Olynyk at $12.8 million. They also sent out Bruce Brown that was making $23 million. So they sent out 35.8, brought back 38.1. So they took on another $2.3 million in this deal. You got the extension. And here's a big number for US. And I'm sure you've looked at this in the wake of the trade. But when you look at what these 3 players are earning for the following season, actually 4 guys. So you look at Ingram, Quickley, Barrett, and Barnes.
Yeah.
Once you hit 25, 26, we're looking at $136.9 million, basically $137 million for 4 players.
Yep.
And just for context for everybody, if we're thinking about the salary cap, the cap is 154. So for 4 players, you are less than $20 million from the salary cap. And obviously the roster size is a lot more than that. So they've put a lot of faith into these 4 players. This is your core here for the most part. So kind of want to start there with just the money situation. Looking at this, how do you feel about the Raptors dedicating so much of their payroll to 4 players, putting their faith in this, signing the Ingram extension? What are your thoughts about all that kind of in the wake of this?
Yeah, well, the other interesting wrinkle to this is that if they end up with a top pick, and depending on where that pick lands, it could kind of muddy the cap sheet a little bit for them as well. So the first overall pick ends up with $11.5 million. That has them pressing up pretty close, actually above the tax, if I imagine, because you've got your numbers right here, $10.5 million with what they currently have moving forward. They can obviously get under that if they get the first overall pick. I don't think that would be an issue, but still you have to clear your rosters. You have to add players, minimum players to be able to get to that point. So does this team want to be a tax team? I imagine they don't want to be a tax team. And so you look at that number, you said $137 million, and you add on some of these other players moving forward. Think about moving forward a Grady Dick contract extension and an Ochai Agbaji contract extension, and how that kind of plays a factor into this whole thing. So this team does get expensive pretty quickly. And I think that's a valid point to make moving forward. But I do think they have the luxury of making a move within the next couple of years. They've given themselves basically a shot clock over the next couple of years to determine whether they want to make a move and make something bigger happen. Now they have multiple salaries to cobble up if they want to go out and try to chase a star. If some other player becomes available that they're interested in, they could use an IQ salary, a Barrett salary, and you're basically looking at $50 million right there. And that's enough to go out and get pretty much any star on the open market right now. So I think there's that version of the plan where you now actually somehow have more flexibility over the next 12 months to 18 months to be able to make a move like that and make a win now move. Or you can eventually use one of these players and trade them for multiple different pieces to be able to add to the roster and build out your rotation. I think ultimately it's a trial period. The way that I would define this next couple of years for the Raptors, and particularly next season, is a trial period. See how Brandon Ingram looks with this team. See how Scotty Barnes looks with this team next to Brandon Ingram and whatnot. See how RJ Barrett and Emmanuel Quickley get acclimated, and then move forward from there. As a way to kind of maybe alleviate some of the concerns here, I mentioned RJ Barrett is extension eligible this summer. Jakob Poeltl is also extension eligible this summer. Some of those decisions will also play a part here in what they will have to do moving forward. So if Barrett, doesn't come to an agreement with the Raptors, if Jakob Poeltl doesn't come to an agreement with the Raptors, there's a way in which they kind of move off of those guys and maybe try to reset around Ingram and Scotty and whatnot. But it does pose a couple of different questions moving forward for this team. There's no question about that. But I think ultimately it's just given them more pieces to work with. Prior to the Ingram trade, they just had two older guys in Olynyk and Bruce Brown who were going to be either expiring within the next couple of years or retiring in the sense of Kelly Olynyk in the next couple of years. So they wanted to get the most for that situation. And really the value that they traded away for Ingram was that 2026 Indiana first round pick, which, given where the Pacers are at in their kind of life cycle as a team, you could imagine it's likely not going to be a playoff, a lottery pick. It'll probably be somewhere within the 15 to 20 range of the draft. And I think that's pretty good value for a guy like Brandon Ingram. Two players that were not part of your long-term core and a first round pick for a guy who likely, like you said, is one of the best, most talented scorers in the league. I think it's good value for getting a guy like that into the door and then worrying about the rest later.
For sure. And I'm glad you brought up the draft pick situation for the Raptors because I think that's where they did a good job. They maintain rights to just almost all of their picks going forward.
Yeah.
The one exception is that 2031 second rounder that they sent on the deal to New Orleans. And I'm sure that's one they're not really thinking about right now. So that's definitely a good point there. I'm actually going to share another screen here. It's going to be the draft pick situation for Toronto here. So now we're here with all the draft picks here. 2031 is what they sent out. And they actually do have Portland's second rounder this year. So they'll have two first rounders. And you brought up the situation with their first rounder adding more payroll because that's probably going to be pretty high. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. But no, I think they're doing a good job from this perspective. You're building out a team that should be very competitive with their core. It's going to cost a lot of money, but you still have a lot of options in terms of your own draft capital. If you want to, send out some of those contracts you already have, like you mentioned before, in addition to some picks, you can do that. So I think Toronto's in really good shape when it comes to, what they own there. They haven't mortgaged their future in that perspective. So just something else I wanted to just kind of mention here real quick. We usually do this on the pods because that's another side of all these trades. You have the picks going back and forth. So wanted to show that as well.
No, yeah, definitely. I mean, look, keeping your picks is important. And like I said, if they end up wanting to go after a star eventually, I think, keeping these picks available to you is really important moving forward. Again, you don't know who's available and who will be on the open market in the summer. You think of I don't know, LaMelo Ball, Devin Booker, Kevin Durant, Trae Young, Giannis. Like these are guys that you always kind of hear maybe there's going to be a situation where they want to change teams. We'll see, right? That's an opportunity. The Raptors have never been afraid to get involved in these type of interactions. And that's sort of what happened with the Brandon Ingram trade as well.
Exactly. So we have those details out of the way. Let's also take a look at what this team might look like when it comes to the encore perspective here. So we touched on this a little bit earlier. When you bring in a guy like Brandon Ingram and you add him to a core that already features Scotty Barnes, it introduces some possible complications when it comes to how they'll fit together on the court. When you look at where these guys like to get their baskets at, and you directly mentioned Scotty Barnes is just his love for the mid-range recently and how he's kind of gravitated to that area. So Scotty takes a whole lot of his attempts from there. He takes about 48% of his shots from the mid-range. That puts him in the 98th percentile for his position. So one of the most mid-range heavy guys from his position. And then Brandon Ingram is just above him at 50% of all his shots.
99th percentile, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Yep. So Clean Glass has those numbers for us, and it kind of paints a picture of hey, these guys love that mid-range area. So obviously, if they both love to operate in there, and then Barrett as well. I mean, he's a lot lower, but he's still above average. 28% of his shots are in that mid-range. So you throw in Ingram to this mix of what they have going on here in the mid-range. Ingram and Barnes, they also don't like to take a lot of threes. It looks like there's going to be some growing pains here. There's going to be a learning curve. So I think that's one area of this trade that made me kind of question it a little bit, have some questions about it, have some concerns.
Yeah.
So there's that part of it. And then there's also just the health aspect when it comes to Brandon Ingram. You won't have to worry about fit concerns if he's not playing. He has missed quite a lot of games. This
Definitely true.
season here,
Yeah.
yep. So this season is the third time he's missed at least 30 games over the course of a season. So when you think about that, it's like, man, like he hasn't even been available that much. He's currently injured with an ankle injury.
Yeah.
So
And I would be surprised if he comes back this season, to be honest.
I would too. I was just thinking that, like they said, indefinitely, but I don't see him coming back. Like, what's the point really at this point? They're so far gone. So, on court perspective, there are questions, there are concerns. Do you think they're overblown? Do you think there's some legitimacy to all this? What are your thoughts about how these guys are going to interact once they're all on the court together?
Man, I've done like a complete 180 on this since they acquired BI. At first, I was not a fan of the on-court fit because, like you, concerned about some of the duplication on the team, some of the mid-range scoring issues, and kind of guys working in similar areas. How does it work with Barrett, who's not necessarily a three-point shooter? Are they going to end up moving Barrett? And what's the equation to everything they want to do on-court? Also, they're already bottom of the league in 3-point rate. I believe they're 29th in 3-point rate this season. So they're not a team that likes to take threes anyways. Adding a guy like Ingram, who has improved, in my opinion, as a 3-point shooter. Still not a guy who likes to take a ton. I think that's part of like the calculus of, okay, what is this fit here? What does this even look like on the court? That said, after watching Ingram tape, I think there's a lot more than meets the eye. First of all, the health is a major part of this. No question to that.
Yeah.
Like he has to stay healthy. And I think that's a major part of like how this team looks moving forward. But the Raptors really desperately need a guy who can make life easier for Scotty Barnes. And I think in that realm, BI accomplishes that as a guy who can just score buckets. There's so many possessions where the Raptors half-court offense gets mulled down. They don't have any sort of offense. They don't have any sort of like shot-making ability. And so they end up with a pretty tough shot. Brandon Ingram is a tough shot maker. And if there's one thing that he's really good at doing, it's taking those shots and making those shots. So ultimately, I think for a team that is struggling in the shot making department and the shot creation department, BI fills a role. And I think ultimately how much more he can tap into the off-ball stuff. He's a 40% catch and shoot player, doesn't take a whole ton of catch and shoot threes, but ultimately he's a guy who over the last couple of seasons has taken over 6 threes a game and has hit them on like decent volume, 37, 36%. I do think some of the 3-point shooting kind of questions are overblown a little bit when it comes to BI. He does take threes, and that says a lot for a team like the Raptors who really doesn't take a lot of threes at all. So it's sort of like finding water in the desert, so to speak, when it comes to Brandon Ingram. He's the type of player they need right now for this iteration. What does that look for their ceiling and the type of team they will be offensively and defensively moving forward? I think it's a question of buy-in from both sides. Like, are you going to adapt to the way Brandon Ingram likes to play, which is holding the ball, which is, working as a pick and roll player and as a guy who can operate in the pick and roll often? The Raptors don't run a ton of pick and roll. They like to move the ball a lot. And so how do you adapt to that? But also, how does Brandon Ingram adapt to your style offensively? So, yeah, I have a lot of questions moving forward, but I have warmed up to the idea that Ingram is going to be a pretty good fit for this Raptors team just because they severely lack in the shot making department right now. And I think that will overall make Scotty's life a little bit easier.
For sure. No, that's a good point. I hadn't really thought about that part of everything when it comes to their offense. They are a shot making star team, like you said. So bringing in a guy like that, if that's what you need, he's one of the best. Like that's his calling card. That's his bread and butter, is to create something out of nothing, make tough shots. And yes, his last playoff appearance there in New Orleans against the Thunder was disappointing to say the least.
Yeah.
But we have seen that, you get to that stage of the season, the postseason, you need guys like that to be able to, get some shots off when the defense clamps down, the game slows down. I think he'll be in his element there for sure.
For sure.
And I think when it comes to Scotty Barnes, I mean, he's young enough that I think he can make somewhat of a transition. I wouldn't expect anything drastic from him in terms of a change, but he could start to cut down a little bit of those mid-range attempts and make some room there for Brandon. Operate in a slightly different way. Maybe get a little bit up that 3-point percentage or 3-point rate a little bit to kind of compensate. When you got a guy like Brandon, he's in the prime of his career. He's in his late 20s. It's I think it's harder for a guy like that to just completely change the way he plays.
Yeah.
But for Scotty, I mean, he's been doing it like we were talking about for the first 4 years of his career, just kind of trying to tinker with things and find where he works best. So from that perspective, yeah, I would say it can definitely work out. They're going to need some time to work on it, and I think a full off season, letting guys get right and things kind of play out, getting in the gym together is going to help a lot and produce a pretty good product when they get back on the court next season. So I think from that perspective, it can work out.
Yeah, I think like when you look at all the things that have plagued this team over the last season or two, it was shot making in the half court. It was a guy who could just get to a bucket eventually. And Brandon Ingram checks those categories. Like that's exactly the type of player that he is. Now, how does that all kind of work and acquiesce with a guy like Scotty Barnes? That's a question moving forward. But ultimately, I think they're in a better position now than they were before the trade deadline, just in terms of talent. Like you add talent to this team, that's a genuine upgrade, and you just have more flexibility to work with that talent moving forward. And we'll see. We'll see if they kind of work well together. If not, they can kind of figure out something else and see what the next version of this team is.
Exactly. Speaking of next version of the team, I mean, it kind of calls into question the future. So we've talked about this season. We talked about where they stand, how the trade has affected them. But, in the years going forward, there's going to be a lot to kind of figure out with this team.
Yep.
So when it comes to the general makeup, I mean, I agree with you. I think they're definitely a better team with Brandon Ingram on board. You bring in an all-star, you don't go backwards. You improve on what you were before. Their offensive rating is going to be better. The defense is still going to be a question, but overall, I wouldn't expect him to finish 13th in the East again, at least if guys are healthy. If Brandon plays at least 60 games or so, I would assume that this team would be improved on what we're seeing right now. But there's also other questions. There's like, how does the bench look? Which of those other guys do they keep around? Grady Dick, I would assume, would be a part of the future going forward, regardless. He's shown a lot of positive flashes in his second season. Jacoby Walter, I think, is a little bit more of a question mark, but there's a lot of moving pieces here when it comes to the bench. Do they re-sign Boucher? Do they bring him back? There's a lot to kind of figure out here. So when it comes to the future makeup of this team, you bring in somebody like Ingram that's a few years younger than Siakam, but definitely a similar level of talent.
For sure.
Where do you see them going? What are some of your general thoughts about like the direction they can go in? And how do you see things playing out a little bit for maybe some of the others that aren't a part of like the true core of the team, like Boucher or Jacoby Walter? What are your thoughts on some of those other guys?
Yeah, I think age-wise, they're big fans of the trio of Grady Dick, Jacoby Walter, and Ochai Agbaji. I think they like all of those guys to varying degrees, obviously, and I think that Grady is a huge part of their future moving forward. With Jacoby and Ochai, it's more wait and see how they develop over the next couple of years. But I think they envision them as part of their quote-unquote core in the next couple of seasons, just as bench guys that can one, hopefully play defense at a high level eventually, and two, be shot makers and guys who can knock down threes for them at a high level. So those three are really important for improving the 3-point rate of this team. Like I mentioned, like just getting them to shoot more threes. And that will help as guys who can come off of the bench and kind of play different positions for them. They have Scotty, they have Ingram, they have RJ, three wings who are not necessarily known as the greatest shooters, but you have three other wings waiting in the wings, no pun intended, to be shot makers for you, right? So I think overall, there's a world in which those three are part of the vision moving forward. That being said, I think a lot has to do with this draft. As truthfully, I think a lot of Raptors fans are, and to be honest with you, the way the Raptors front office has talked over the last couple months, they understand the importance of nailing this 2025 draft, whether that be getting the 7th overall pick or getting the 1st overall pick or getting the 3rd overall pick. There is an importance to nailing this pick because I don't think they have intentions of tanking or losing anymore. I think they're pretty much done with the whole let's suck season. I think they're more interested in being competitive moving forward. I think a lot of their players, and, we just talked about the financial aspect. This is a team that, at least from a finance perspective, should be competing more often. And so when you have a salary cap of like 4 or 5 guys making 150, $160 million, yeah, you need to be competitive. And so I think they eventually will. I think next season is a season where they're going to try to go for the play-in, maybe try to be a playoff team, especially in the Eastern Conference where there's tons of inconsistencies there in that range of teams. I think, honestly, if they were healthy this season, they probably would have been a play-in team. But overall, I think that's their goal. It's being able to be competitive next season and put their full foot forward. What that looks with that pick is going to be intriguing, because if they land the number 1 overall pick, then it's okay. It's how do you incorporate Cooper Flagg into the situation, right? Because you have tons of wings. Where does Cooper end up playing? You get the 2nd overall pick. It's like Dylan Harper or Ace Bailey or whoever else you like in that spot. And there's kind of that equation of like, how do those two play a factor on this team? And so overall, I think they just need to nail this draft, and that will hopefully change the trajectory of this team in a positive way and add another talent to this team. You think of like a group, like you mentioned, that's really unique, right? With the way that they can play, and kind of there's a lot of duplication there, but maybe there's a world in which it can work. They are missing one piece to be able to be really competitive and intriguing. That one piece could be obtained at the draft.
In the draft. Yep, exactly. No, my thoughts exactly. When it comes to this draft, I think it's a little bit more in question than it was maybe, say, 6 months ago in terms of overall talent. But still, I mean, if you're going to be a top 5, top 6 in the draft, I mean, it's an incredible opportunity to go and get somebody that you can pair alongside the guys you already have.
For sure.
There's not a ton of pressure on them. They're coming in, they're playing alongside Scotty Barnes, they're playing alongside Brandon Ingram, guys that are established contributors. So obviously there's going to be a level of expectation there, but you're not counting on them to kind of carry your team in any sort of way, or to, just do anything crazy. You bring them in and say like, hey, this is the role we envision for you, and you see what you got there. Mm-hmm. So I think that provides a lot more upside to this team, because some people might look at the core they have right now and say like, that's not quite a championship core, but we have to allow for more growth from Scotty, more growth from guys like Quickley, that draft pick that comes in, regardless of who it is. I think there's a lot of talent there, possible talent in the top 5, top 6, top 7 that the Raptors can add. And like, they can really do some damage here. So they can start to kind of make that gradual build up to what they want to be, which is eventually title contenders. So for sure, I agree with that. And then the point you brought up about their salary cap, I think that's very important to keep in mind. As the money goes up, so do the expectations for a team.
Yeah.
So, you look at a team that's already going to be over the cap. They're probably going to be flirting with the tax. You're going to need to be at a certain level, which I would say is at least fighting for a playoff spot at bare minimum with the payroll like that. And they're going to be in the mix. So I do applaud the management for Toronto for taking a swing, because players like Brandon Ingram, it's tough to draft a guy that good. Mm-hmm. First off, a guy that's an all-star. And then, for a market like Toronto, and I mean, you live there, so I mean, I'm sure you know that like Toronto's a solid market, but again, they're not Los Angeles. They're not.
Yeah, they're not a free agency destination. That's true. I mean, you can just look at the snow that's right here, and you could see that they're not necessarily the biggest free agency. Look, it's true. It's true. I think that's part of their calculus when trying to acquire guys. I mean, the way that they kind of function in general is buying low on players, because they know that they're not going to be attracting those players in any sort of way because of the fact that it's Toronto and it's Canada. And I think that's just the reality of the situation with the Raptors and the way that they build teams. Some teams, like the Lakers, can just trade for Luka Doncic. Other teams have to buy low on players and hope. It's just the way the NBA works. There's certain markets that have to go about things different ways, and the Raptors, got to go about it this way.
Yeah, exactly right. So we'll see how it goes. It's definitely a risk.
Yep.
Ingram has to stay healthy. The guys have to fit together. But no, if it works, I think we're going to look back on this deal and say, like, I mean, they were really onto something here when it comes to reorienting their team.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's also just hard to be bad for too long.
Yeah.
You go and look at Detroit and what they suffered through for years, Sacramento before they got to be what they are today. It's really hard to have a team that's consistently at the bottom. Charlotte, I mean, it seems like they're just going to be there forever at this rate. But no, for Toronto, I think they had a couple of years where they're near the bottom and they're ready to jump back up. So I think kudos to them for seeing an opportunity, jumping on it, and retooling their team, kind of like OKC did, where they had a couple of years to where they were in the lottery, but they were able to retool quickly, and now they're a title contender again here in just like 3 or 4 years. So
Absolutely.
maybe Toronto could go be on that trajectory and really get back to relevance here in the near future. So there's a lot that could happen in the next year or two, but I think in the meantime, there's a lot more hope, a lot more optimism, and somewhat of a direction when it comes to like what Toronto's doing.
For sure. Yeah, man. Definitely agree.
Good stuff. So I think that's about all I have as for you, unless you had something else on Toronto you wanted to discuss.
No, man. Honestly, I think we covered it, to be honest with you. Appreciate you having me on air as always.
Yeah.
Thank you for bringing me on to talk about the Raptors, man.
Absolutely. As if people want to find some of your work, some of what you do on a daily basis, where can they find you? Social handles, websites, anything like that? Go ahead and plug what you're a part of here while I got you on.
Yeah, I mean, well, if you're listening to me here for Raptors stuff, you can check me out on Raptors Republic, do writing, do, video stuff for them regularly. You can check out the recaps that I do for every single game. It's kind of like a play breakdown type of thing that I do for them. And then, for NBA stuff, I am one of the hosts of Athletic NBA Daily. And so we cover the NBA, which is a fun league to cover every single day. And so tons of fun stuff there. Appreciate you guys. Follow me on Twitter as well, I guess, or Blue Sky. It's the same thing at Esfandiar Baraheni. Appreciate you, man. Appreciate you having me on.
100%. And if you guys are looking for more content like this, more great guests, I guess that I have here on this evening, you can check us out, notradeclause.com. Our socials, no trade clause, all one word on Instagram, no trade_clause on Twitter. We have more clips. We have more content, more graphics over there. So if you want to check that out, we are trying to bring you guys as much as we can as the season begins to wind down. Yeah. So, it's been fun. Thanks, guys, for checking out this episode. And we hope to see you on the next installment of NTC. Take care, everybody.